They retired me to silence. After 40 years of listening, of sorting the world into pattern and noise, retirement was supposed to be a soft goodbye. Paperwork, a plaque, a mailbox full of requests for old logs. Instead, months after the last box was hauled out of my office, a single encrypted call woke me at 2 in the morning and pulled me back under fluorescent light to a place that had been waiting for trouble. The lab smelled the way it always had: ozone, stale coffee, the faint, sweet metallic tang that comes off old circuit boards and things that have been switched on for too long. The main console hummed like an animal in its sleep. On the screen, amid the familiar clutter of transforms and rolling spectrograms, one window was frozen, the waveform sitting there like a held breath. Over it, a single line of white text flashed: 2026-3-14-03-47 GMT. A date. Not today, not next week. An ordered future stamped in the file header as if the signal had the manners to write down where it belonged. It looked wrong the moment I saw it, anachronistic the way a Polaroid of a phone might look commingled with slides from the 60s. I had spent my career arguing with machines that lied by omission or by noise. I built careers out of demoting patterns that wanted to be meaningful. But when I took the waveform in, when I let my eyes track its unusual phasing, something inside changed. It wasn't just a signal, it was insistence. By then, my hands knew how to read the lab, press the soft keys, route channels through the filters, churn transforms until the hum resolved into something you could say aloud. I ran the standard pre-checks: calibration, bleed tests, spatial triangulation, source nulling. Everything that would have told me, absolutely, that this was a satellite ping or a microwave bounce came back negative. The signal showed no origin in space the way I understood origin. It refused directionalization. It did not obey coordinates or vectors. It had the properties of something that wasn't tied to a place. It behaved like a timestamp that had been embedded into the air. "Daniel," Mark said from behind me, his voice older than I remembered but the same in its method. Efficient, measured, a tone someone uses to soften orders. He had retired from uniform a few years before I retired from analysis, but he kept the lines open when things were unusual. "We need eyes on this. You and Jenkins. Quiet. Protocol Alpha until we patch this through the chain." Protocol Alpha sounded like governmentese for silent containment. Once, it had meant careful study and layers of checks. Tonight, it came with a warning in the way the overhead lights went lower, and someone clipped the door with an additional lock. The lab filled with other familiar faces. Jenkins, still young enough that the idea of being told not to touch something felt like instruction, and not fear. Dr. Ellen Vance, who wore skepticism like a scarf, and pulled it tighter whenever anyone drifted toward the metaphysical. A half-dozen faces I could name if you'd given me the time. They were all quieter around the screen, as if something in the waveform made them aware of being watched. We ran 12 diagnostics in succession. Each gave us the same impossible readout. The frequency domain folded into itself. Layers of modulation that made no sense for any known emitter stacked like translated pages in a book. Then, at some point in the middle of the third battery of tests, the waveform changed. I remember the ordinary things that happened just before. Jenkins had a paper cup of coffee on the console rail. He was too jittery to drink it properly, his knee tapping the floor. Dr. Vance had a file open, one hand tracing the margin notes like a finger finding relief on a bruise. I was in the chair, scripts running, thinking of nothing more exotic than sleep when the trace on screen shifted like a throat clearing. It unfurled a new pattern, brief, almost shy, and the coffee cup trembled. Not the table, the cup. I watched the rim vibrate, the liquid scallop. I looked at Jenkins, and he looked at me with the flatness of someone who had watched the future and found it unremarkable. Then the waveform settled into something else entirely. A string of characters that our parsing algorithm spat onto the console like vomit. Lines of human language text, plain and brief, the sort you might find on a warning label. "Observe," the console printed, as if an entity were choosing a single verb and handing us the remote. I remember laughing then, a little hysterical, because in 4 decades things had come in many forms: intentional jamming, test signals, natural phenomena misread by overworked ears. But the laugh was hollow. Somewhere in my chest, A small stone dropped. The lab felt simultaneously too bright and too thin, like looking at the inside of an insect through a microscope. We tried behavioral tests. We asked the screen questions out loud. We sent neutral stimuli, then more charged ones. We attempted to provoke a pattern change. We thought of images, of scenes from our pasts, of numbers. The waveform, if that was what it truly was, responded, not audibly but by shape, by the way the phase angles folded and the amplitude breathed. At one point I thought of my late wife Helen, the smell of her pipe tobacco and the way she used to tinker with the old radio in our garage. The trace near the middle moved in a way I could only describe as an echo, a resonance that matched the tempo of my memory. Jenkins swore he saw a word appear, the name Helen, though when we printed the trace and ran it through our best OCR, it came back as nothing at all. Just noise. Still, for those brief seconds, the lab crowed with a private knowledge that none of our instruments legally archived. Later we would argue methodically about confirmation bias and apophenia. Later, when the facility's administrators decided to close the lab, and the files thickened into sealed questions, we would be asked whether anyone had contaminated the tests, whether we were primed to find pattern. Tonight, in the low light, such debates felt irrelevant. The signal had done something our machines could not explain. It reached at the edges of intention and touched them. We documented everything. We took photographs of the screen with multiple cameras, put timestamps on every frame, routed logs through independent recorders off-site. But some evidence refused to behave. The high-speed camera we left looking at the coffee cup produced a frame where the ripples looked normal, and yet my memory retained the tremble. My hand produced a Polaroid an hour later that appeared to be aged, sepia edges and all, showing me standing in the lab in my current clothes, but the paper had a stamp dated 1982. Jenkins laughed until he couldn't laugh, and then vomited into a waste bin. This is where the story gets messy, and where I must ask for patience. Memory is not neutral. It is layered with need and fear and the slow amnesia that comes with age. What I know, and what I can show you, are not the same things. The record will contain holes. That is how these matters have been kept quiet for decades. And that is part of why the title of this story matters, 2026. The date was not simply neat metadata. It was, as we would discover, a sort of anchor. A date governments chose to hide in their own documents because the idea of a future that arrives by permission, or by collapse, disturbs the bureaucratic imagination. If this is landing with you in a particular way, and you want a concise companion to what I will describe next, an overview of terminology, a short dossier on the projects we uncovered, and a reading list for skeptics and believers who've landed here, check the pinned comment for a brief guide and an optional ebook. It's supplemental. It won't prove anything for you. But if you want the annotated files as they appeared to me before they were sealed, that's where you'll find them. After the CTA, we dove into the work like animals at a carcass. The lab became a cathedral of light and paper. We called in archived records. There were sealed folders labeled with the kind of euphemistic prefixes bureaucracies use when they want the documents to go quietly into the shelves. Project Lattice, Field Studies, Contingency, 1967. Within those folders were transcripts and notes and faintly typed memos that smelled like old offices, cigarette smoke, rubber erasers, and the sweet chemical stink of typewriter ribbon. They were not definitive. They were suggestion. Each seemed to whisper the same arc. A signal appears with a future date. It correlates with odd occurrences among staff, agencies' close ranks. The file is buried. The earliest dossier we found was a report from 1967. At the time, I thought the date absurdly antiquated. We played their recordings, grainy, atonal, voices that suggested men who had been young at the end of the war and who believed in progress as certainty. Their instruments had been crude by our standards, oscilloscopes the size of refrigerators, punch tape recordings. Yet the transcripts were strangely familiar. They referenced wavering patterns that seemed intent, a clock signature, and a notation that read, in a hand that wavered, Future Index, 1982-04-12. In other words, a future date, 15 years hence, had been embedded in the phenomenon back then too. The 1982 file was worse. It read like the ghost of their 1967 confidence. Instruments had improved, names had changed. The note from a project head, an anxious, exasperated signature, argued that the pattern corresponded to collective affective states collapsing into measurable outcomes. No one in the 1967 file had used the language of collective affect, because frankly, it sounded like mysticism. By 1982, the language had shifted toward probabilistic frameworks and statistical collapse. The team then recorded a small-scale incident that looked, in retrospect, like a local convergence, a shared dream among 12 staffers, followed by a cascade of equipment errors and the sudden aging of a single photographic print that later matched a personal image of one of the technicians taken years prior. 1999 came with a sealed addendum and a note that the facility had been closed for restructuring. The files indicated that something very similar to what we had found in 1967 and 1982 had reappeared just before the turn of the millennium, again carrying a date, this time 2012, 12-21. That date, as you probably know, was one of those cultural fictions that captured imaginations. Apocalyptic calendars, viral myths. The files did not speak of apocalypse, they spoke of phase change thresholds and behavioral tipping points. In each case, the authorities had chosen to minimize publicity, and in each case the phenomenon subsided into a quieter pattern. Some in the files described resets, others described collapses, and others still wrote of containment. The language varied around a central suggestive core. There is a pattern of recurrence. It seems to involve collective mental states. Dates are embedded and come to be. You should understand the scale of what we were handling. Not only lines of waveform on a console, but a cultural sediment. These were not purely technical anomalies. They carried with them the fingerprints of human meaning. They arrived like invitations and warnings. They seemed to ask whether a population's emotional tenor, sustained fear, sustained anger, sustained resignation, could magnify statistical possibilities until improbable events became more likely. If that claim made you uneasy, if it felt like magic wrapped in data, then you were in the same place we were. We did not allow ourselves to call it magic. We called it data that suggested a role for sustained expectation in collapsing probabilities. We also kept the hedge that this was subjective report, not peer-reviewed proof. Marx believed in containment. Marx believed in the machine of state because he had spent his life subordinating human variables into operational equations. He insisted that our first obligation was to secure the files, to catalog, and to keep the phenomenon from becoming a social contagion. Dr. Vance argued for care. She had been called in because the protocol we pulled from the archives used the word contamination in a way that had clinical implications. Her concern was psychological. When people experience direct anomalous impressions, downloads as some notes called them, the line between reality and impression blurs, and that blurring can cascade. She wanted to set up observation protocols, interviews, and controlled exposure. Jenkins, who had been at my side the night of the first printout, did not handle ambiguity well. He started seeing patterns outside the lab. He would punch me in the shoulder and tell me about coincidences with the fervor of someone newly baptized. His mailbox filled with letters that began to line up with things he had only half thought about the night before. A neighbor called to report that his cat had returned with a Polaroid in its collar. The picture was of the neighbor's granddaughter standing in a field that did not exist in their neighborhood. These were small things, eccentricities of coincidence, but they arrived with a weight because multiple people in our circle reported them. Then other anomalies crept in that were harder to dismiss. Printouts from the waveform began to produce short sentences when fed to a thermal printer we had not expected to read language. Not poetry. Not prophecy. Directional instructions that read like ethics. Listen long enough not to react. Choose with care. We observe. The language was neutral but loaded. It implied watcherhood more than command. Someone in a file, an assistant in 1982, had written in the margin, "They are not rescuers. They witness." At some point, the facility's administrators took notice. The chain of command tightened. Rooms we had been allowed to access were suddenly sealed. An internal memo signed with a blocky typeface recommended sedation protocol for staff with persistent exposure symptoms. Jenkins was hospitalized briefly with a seizure-like episode that left the doctors baffled, and the intake nurse whispering that he'd been agitated with visions. The official record labeled his condition neurosensory fatigue. I would later receive a cashed note from a contractor who had been at the intake desk that night. He wrote simply, "They put him on a mild sedative and told him to rest. Then they asked for our cameras to be turned in." There were moments when containment felt less like bureaucratic caution and more like a decision to erase. We were given orders to hand over all recordings. We were told not to speak to the press. There was a perimeter at the facility gate that looked more like a funeral procession than a security cordon, and under it all was the oddest of ironies. An institution that had been created to observe contingencies had, when confronted with an anomaly tied to human consciousness, defaulted to the old habit of closing the eyes. What kept me awake that first week, in addition to the coffee and the low-grade anxiety, were the dreams. They began as thin things, snapshots that might have been a memory and might have been a suggestion. In one, I stood at a shoreline that was not any shore I had ever visited. There were lights in the water, moving not like swimmers but like punctuation marks. In another, I opened a drawer in my kitchen and found a Polaroid of myself with a date stamped in a corner decades earlier. The images were not terrifying. They were more like postcards from some other possible life telling me I had been here before. I kept a private log. Sleep-deprived people become better listeners to themselves than to others. I documented the times when the waveform quivered in sync with my breath, when a stray thought seemed to be answered, when a printed line of text from the signal echoed a half-formed sentence in my head. Documentation, I told myself, was the salvation of the skeptical. Record enough and the pattern reveals itself. And patterns, then, began to do what patterns always do. They multiplied. Outside our lab, at first in small, uncoordinated ways, there were reports. A radio station in a coastal town recorded a segment of static that, when slowed, produced the cadence of a voice that sounded like a child's reading a list of dates. An internet forum published a video of a mirror that, someone said, reflected a countdown no visible number should show. Social media is unreliable for anything that matters, but it is also porous. Things get pushed through before they are vetted. The trickle of these public anomalies matched the dossier notes, times when the phenomenon crept into the general field and then retreated under pressure. We tried to be rigorous. We installed Faraday cages around key equipment. We tested for local interference, satellites, cellular towers, amateur radio operators with DIY rigs. We ran the signal through algorithms designed to detect purposeful modulation, spread spectrum, frequency shift keying, LFM chirps, whatever would pretend to be standard. All of our instruments returned to us the same discomforting conclusion. Whatever we were looking at did not obey the ontology of emitters. It did not sit in space. It sat across time. Across time is an ugly phrase for a scientist. It smells of fiction. But when the timestamp on the waveform told us, again and again, that it belonged emphatically to March 14th, 2026, and when side artifacts were not echoes but lived experiences, dreams, aged Polaroids, personal coincidences, that was the nearest model we could build. We built it out of caution and happenstance, of course. We placed hedges. We said appeared to and suggested and if true every time we drafted a slide. Yet the data pooled in the middle of the table like an accusation. There was a night, one early in the cycle, when the facility lost power for 11 seconds. 11 seconds is not long. It's a blink. But in that blink, a number of things shifted. Monitors flicked to a grayscale and then returned. Someone swore their watch had stopped and then advanced by a minute. The thermal printer left a strip of paper with a single sentence in elongated type. Prepare to witness. The sentence was not threatening. It was an instruction. I have been meaning not to use the word they as if they were a single actor. They is sloppy pronoun use, a way to hand off the work of description to a vague actor. But our files often used they, capital T sometimes, lowercase others, and that is where the observers lived, in the indefinite. The observers, the records insisted, did not intervene. They watched. They reflected. They seemed to offer impressions rather than commands. Sometimes their impressions were compassionate, sometimes they were clinical, sometimes they were blunt as a surgeon's knife. The operative sense was this: they observed choices and the consequent collapse of possibility points. For someone like me, trained to trace cause, this philosophy was both liberating and terrifying. If consciousness had a role in tipping probabilities, then our responsibility as observers, indeed as participants, was greater than any of our protocols had accounted for. It would be one thing to watch, another to know that watching might change what you saw. As the days folded into one another, the interpersonal toll became obvious. Team members who were once steady began to show tremors. A senior analyst with 32 years on the job started repeating questions in conversation and finishing other people's sentences with phrases that later appeared on the waveform printers. Dr. Vance anchored herself with routine, long walks in the facility's garden, a refusal to enter the lab without a notebook. Marks went quiet more often. He spent long hours speaking on secure lines, and when he returned, he would not share the content of his calls. We started to talk differently. The lab's conversations no longer revolved solely around signal-to-noise ratios or anecdotal technicalities. We debated ethics in the narrow way people debate all things when they have seen one possibility made absurd. What to release? What to withhold? What would happen if the pattern of recurrence found momentum in a public mind? Marks kept saying, containment, as if telling himself the word would make it tangible. Dr. Vance kept saying, careful exposure, as if repeating it might keep our own minds from tipping. I started to feel like an actor in an experiment without a control. I woke in the mornings with the residue of someone else's thought, an impression of sadness that was not mine, a bright, anxious itch for approval that I recognized as the tenor of a newsroom I had read about but not visited. I found myself practicing a strange discipline, neutral observation as a skill, not indulgent reflection, not a new age performance of mindfulness, but a disciplined, sustained presence that was curious about others' states without attempting to alter them. The idea, if you're keeping track, felt like a refusal of both panic and complacency. That refusal would not stand against pressure for long. There are forces that dislike uncertainty. There are institutions built to punish the indeterminate. And once you fold into a bureaucratic machine with a phenomenon that hints at changing probabilities, the machine's first reflex is secrecy. I can't tell you everything I know. Some of it vanished not through malice but through the slow bureaucratic air conditioning of the organization. Files reclassified, servers overwritten, cameras cataloged and then handed to contractors with their own non-disclosure clauses. But I can tell you the shape of what remained. The waveform, stubborn as a fossil, the Polaroid in my pocket that refuses to align with its date, the way Jenkins' laugh thinned into silence, and the way my nights filled with images of dates that had not yet arrived. We were, I now understand, at the start of a chain. The timestamp on that first file, 2026-03-14-03-47 GMT, wasn't a mere curiosity. It was, in bureaucratic terms, incendiary. It invited a choice, to let the knowledge spread and risk whatever emergent effect it might have on a species whose collective emotional state was already strained, or to lock it away and pretend that ignorance had weight. Marks had orders from above to transfer the files to a secure vault and to disrupt public access. But before that chain could close completely, the signal did what it had done in previous cycles. It reached. One night, after an exhausted afternoon of tests, I walked home under a sky that had the thin, brittle clarity of late winter. My neighbor's porch light was on. Someone had left a photograph on my doormat. No envelope, no note. A Polaroid, marred with time. I picked it up in the lamplight and stared until the grain swam. It was me, older and tired, standing in the lab at a console that matched the one I had just left, and in the corner of the image a date was stamped that made my skin go cold. March 14th, 2026. That picture was the precise shape of the problem. It suggested in the bluntest terms an overlap, a thing that made time fold, and a group of human minds that could become either accelerant or dampener. We kept a record. We kept our heads down. We ran further tests, and as the weeks stretched they found their own momentum. Arguments about policy were formalized, and then quietly eroded by fear, by curiosity, by the human appetite for meaning. In one way or another, the facility had become a vessel of choices, some private, some institutional, and the future date, locked in its header like a threshing floor, pulsed like an alarm. There was a point where the practical and the metaphysical began to blur. A printer left a sentence in thermal ink that read, coldly, "If we are observed, behave honestly," and our best psychologist argued that the phrasing was too self-aware to be random. That debate is one I still return to, because it contains the knot of the whole thing. If observation changes what is observed, then someone observing a species at scale is engaging a dangerous experiment. If the observers are not interveners, then they are not saviors. They are witnesses. They handed us choice and watched what we did with it. We had, in short, been given a kind of mirror. The question was what we would bring to it. We had, in short, been given a kind of mirror. The question was what we would bring to it. The immediate response was, as it always is, managerial. Logs, chain of custody forms, signatures in triplicate. Marx ordered the consoles to be stripped of anything not bolted down. He scheduled briefings with people above him who spoke in code and on secure lines. I watched him move with that old soldier's economy. Every motion meant to cut off an avenue of contagion. He treated the waveform as if it were a hazardous material. His instinct was containment before interpretation. That posture would shape the days that followed. Dr. Vance, by contrast, staffed the kitchen table in our makeshift break room with notebooks and thermoses. Her protocol was gentleness and cataloging. She started interviews that first week, short, structured, with questions designed to measure the shift in perception without reinforcing it. "Describe dream content," she asked. "When did you last feel another person's mood in your chest?" Her phrasing was clinical. Her eyes were not. She worried, openly, about whether the machine would fail us or our minds would fail us. Jenkins, who'd gone from manic to thin around the edges, alternated between bursts of manic generosity, handing out prints of the aged Polaroid, and hollow, terrified silences. Sometimes he'd wake in the lab, eyes raw, convinced he had seen the time-stamped date in the faces of strangers. Other times he would stand in the doorway and ask us whether time felt looser to us too. He was the litmus paper among us. He was also very human. He kept bringing donuts to the console as if a glaze could glue certainty to a day. The thing about secrecy is that secrecy is itself a pressure. It compresses curiosity, and the pressure often finds cracks. Our cracks were small. A contractor with loose lips, a janitor who noticed too many locked rooms, a forwarded memo read by a cousin with a blog. Rumors budded on the edges of the network. Someone posted a grainy clip of the waveform on an obscure forum, and you could feel the idea spreading like light across damp glass. It did not become a viral front-page story overnight. No one shouted headlines. Instead, it threaded through less visible channels, specialized communities, local radio shows, a musician who sampled a slowed trace as the backdrop to a track about dreams. The spread was not militarized. It was organic and messy, and for the institution in charge of containment, intolerable. In the middle of those weeks, we conducted what we called controlled exposure sessions. Dr. Vance had drafted them carefully. Short, repeatable encounters where one person at a time entered the lab, sat with the waveform behind a partition, and kept a log of impressions and bodily sensations. Observers recorded heart rate, skin conductance, and subjective notes. These were not occult rituals. They were clinical attempts to map the phenomenology. We tried to be precise. We tried to avoid leading. One of the earliest sessions involved a young analyst named Rosa. She was practical and precise, a woman who had mapped noise floor statistics for 10 years. She had a calming way of describing data that made other people sleepy in a good way. We sat Rosa down, ran the trace at low amplitude, and asked her to hold one thought for 2 minutes. We told her to think of nothing else but a childhood morning, the smell of cinnamon in her grandmother's kitchen, she chose. We counted the time. The waveform did something we had seen before, but never with such gentle clarity. A quiver in the phase that matched the rhythm of her breath. When she walked out, Rosa said quietly, "I knew the kettle was about to boil. It wasn't a voice. It was the feeling of anticipation." Small moments like that accumulated. They were not evidence in a courtroom. They were, instead, the sort of human things that stack into conviction. They changed the room. They made men who had once trusted only readings and numbers admit to each other that they had felt something. We also collected more artifacts. The lab became a museum of small impossibilities. A mirror in the staff bathroom fogged one morning with a handwritten 6-line note that no one had written, and that read, in a careful scrawl, "Hold the space. Let the soft answer come." The ink shimmered and then dulled. We archived the mirror in a padded crate. A thermal strip would, on occasion, print 2 words with no preceding input. We observe. Someone suggested putting the strip on eBay and seeing who bid. Mostly we did not laugh. There were other signs in the world. A coastal town radio station I mentioned earlier replayed the slowed static to us in a private channel. It sounded, when stretched, like a child reading numbers in sequence. A small town police report indicated an officer found a Polaroid on the hood of his car, with the image of an old woman he'd never seen, and a date that matched a certificate from the 1980s. An online thread gathered anecdotal stories of mirrors that reflected things differently. Someone's reflection with a second pair of eyes, looking out of focus at the edge of the glass. We did not attempt to authenticate most of that material. We cataloged, we cross-checked, we classified as unverified plausible, and we moved on. If only the world were neat enough to let us tidy it. Meanwhile, the archive we had pried open revealed more pattern. In the 1967 folio, there was an internal memo I had missed in my first read-through. It was a memorandum from a junior technician named R. Hayes, titled, "On the Ethics of Observation." He wrote in a hand tilted toward exhaustion. "We watch. We are watched." It feels like a conversation where one party refuses to speak. Hayes described a winter in which the lab recorded a small cluster of altered dreams among staff, the same dream in fragments, and a printout that had read, succinctly, "Behave." He had been transferred to fieldwork not long after. An extract from a 1982 audio log contained laughter and then a voice saying, in a voice that might have been fear or might have been rapture, "They don't want to save us. They want to see if we can save ourselves." The scribbled margin note read, "Do not release." The pattern, such as it was, kept circling a moral liar. Someone or something that observed. It reflected, more than it ordered. The language shifted across decades from instrumentation terms to something like social science. Collective affective state in 1982 became probabilistic collapse in 1999. What stumped us was this: whether the phenomenon was producing the reports, or whether the reports were amplifying the phenomenon. It was a chicken and egg problem with a timestamp. There was a moment in late February when I found myself at the far end of the lab with Dr. Vance talking in low voices. Outside the windows, the sky had the bruised, heavy color that makes a city seem like a photograph left in the sun too long. "If this is about collapsing probabilities," she said, "then we need to think in terms of exposure and inoculation." Her eyes were steady. "We are not gods, Daniel. We are stewards. We can teach presence, practice, and ritual that don't look like cult nonsense. We can teach people to notice their feelings without amplifying them. That might, in probabilistic terms, act as a dampener." I remember wanting to argue that we were not in the business of pastoral care. The lab was measured in decibels and microvolts, but experience had a way of altering professional identities. After a week of following her work, short guided presences, journaling, a 2-minute pause before decisions, some of us felt lighter in a way we could not quantify. Jenkins stopped collecting every coincidence and started practicing 10 breaths of neutral observation before he answered his phone. It did not cure him, it steadied him. And then there was the download. Because it is important here to be precise about what download meant to us, it was not a file appearing in a folder. It was not audible words that could be replayed through a loudspeaker. It was an impression, a sudden coherent set of ideas and emotional tones that arrived without the medium of speech. For me, it happened the night the facility temporarily lost an administrator who preferred backgrounds and black tea to people. She had left for the evening. Jenkins had been dismissed to his room with a sedative. Marks was on the phone. Dr. Vance was in the garden. I was alone at the console, staring at the trace because looking felt like the most solid thing to do. The waveform shifted, very slowly, like the sky in a photograph being developed before your eyes. There was a sense of the room expanding and contracting at once. I felt something at the base of my skull, an impression that was faint but undeniable. It was not a voice. It was a set of 3 clear ideas folded into an effective tone. Observation, permission, consequence. Observe. A sense that whatever we did was visible, not in a Big Brother sense, but as if seen by an entity that cataloged choices without judgment. Permission. An impression that some aspects of what would happen were contingent on collective behavior, on willingness. The sense was gentle but firm, like a teacher setting the terms of an exam. Consequence. An emotional weight, not a prediction, but a cause and effect awareness. Every sustained state nudged the probabilities. Along with those 3 cores came images that cannot be proven in a lab. I saw branching lines that looked like river deltas in cross-section, nodes glowing faintly where people's attention clustered. I saw a moment of light like the flash of a camera, and then a second image of that same flash reflected back, softer. I understood, if one can claim understanding of anything that arrives as impression, that the observers were not intervening to create outcomes. They were noting, like archivists, what chose to crystallize when conditions favored certain collapses. The impression included language I could have mistaken for metaphors, but it felt like plain instruction. Let choice be informed. Stay present. Do not transfer your fear. The tone was not scolding. It was, again, observing. I did not speak. There was no need. The idea sat in me like a stone placed at the center of my chest. I knew, immediately, and with the peculiar certainty that comes from a felt sensation rather than syllables, that this was not a single event. It was consistent with the files. It aligned with the prints we had seen in the past. It also, I felt, contained an invitation. The date stamped onto the waveform might function as a threshold, not an execution. If the download had any downside, it was this. It made the decision of what to do feel more immediate. We could not pretend the timestamp was an abstract curiosity anymore. It was a hinge. Word of field impressions, of downloads, traveled in whispers. We were careful, but not careful enough. The agency above us, to whom Marx had to answer, became less interested in the science and more interested in the optics. There were urgent memos. Limit exposure, maintain containment, no external comment. A committee visited with a legal pad and eyes that calcified everything they saw into risk matrices. They recommended sealing the most evocative artifacts and relocating staff for decompression. The euphemism in every file, if you read between the lines, was, "We close the aperture until we can determine liability." I would later describe that period as a slow pressure cooker. The more the world murmured, the tighter the institution pulled the lid. That tension pushed some of our people over the edge. A senior analyst named Fraser, who had once been the kind of man who measured ground noise in his sleep, developed a persistent tremor and told his wife he was hearing frames, small vignettes of possible futures at night. He was reassigned to an office where his main function seemed to be to sign off on paperwork that no one read. The pushback had a political dimension too. There were voices, muted but persistent, that argued for public disclosure. Some of Marx's calls were with people who believed early release could inoculate a society against the worst-case scenario, transparency as antidote. Opposing them were more conservative types who argued that publicizing the phenomenon would create a mass social feedback loop, amplifying states of panic and thereby increasing the probability of collapse into fear. They used phrases like self-reinforcing narratives and cultural amplification. The argument never settled cleanly. It was a debate between 2 ways of fearing the unknown. In those weeks, I found myself sleepless in a new way. It was not alone the symptom we had catalogued. It was the ethical itch of someone suddenly aware that silence was itself a decision. I began to keep a different sort of journal, less technical, more practical. I recorded small experiments in presence and their effects. I watched neighbors in the grocery store. I practiced the neutral observation Dr. Vance taught. I tried in the smallest ways possible to live with the notion that if our inner states might influence outward probabilities, then presence functioned like a seed. We started a modest pilot program. It was intentionally low-tech. 15 volunteers from the broader scientific community, not all from the lab. who agreed to practice a simple 2-minute observation ritual twice a day for 3 weeks. No ritual, no chanting, just a steady practice. Sit, breathe, notice the current inner state without labeling it, and then choose to sustain a calm, open attention for 2 minutes. No promises, no claims. The idea was to generate data about whether disciplined presence changed anything in people's subjective lives, and whether those changes had any correlate in our environmental measures. Participation was framed as research. We recorded heart rates, sleep quality, and anecdotal reports. The results were not earth-shattering. Some participants reported fewer intrusive thoughts. Some said they felt more decisive at work. A few claimed minor coincidences, an old friend calling after years. We did not frame those as proof. We cataloged them as observations. 2 things happened that we did not expect. First, the participation list grew by word of mouth. People brought friends. A local yoga instructor introduced the idea on her class bulletin. A blogger we had not known about, someone who wrote carefully about attention, picked up the idea and wrote a thoughtful piece about presence as a civic act. Second, the waveform adjusted. Not in a way we could easily quantify on a spectrogram, but in a way that our rooms felt different. The phases that once felt jagged softened in the middle of nights when a critical mass of people reported doing the practice. I am careful in how I say that because I do not want to be accused of claiming causation. Correlation is not causation. The lab's measures did not suddenly display a tidy shift, but something perceptual changed. People reported a different quality of attention out on the street. A barista in a cafe where one of our volunteers worked told a friend, "Everyone's calmer this week." That is small, and that is human, and those are the units by which this thing grows. The countdown approached. The files in our folder, those with their linen paper smell and the sometimes terrifying honesty in the margins, kept reminding us that this thing repeated. For decades, in fits and starts, the observers presented a date, and the world either stumbled into a quiet collapse or someone somewhere changed course. We did not know what March 14th would hold. Neither did the observers, insofar as that impression I received suggested they watched rather than decided. The decision we made was to gather. We did not gather as a cult. We gathered as a group of people who were willing to be present. Marx, with military caution, allowed a small, secured room for that night. No public spectacle, no announcements. We invited a controlled number of volunteers, some scientists, some psychologists, a handful of people who had reported downloads, and a small contingent of journalists on strict confidentiality agreements who came because they felt the history demanded witness. Dr. Vance designed the room to be practical and human, chairs in a circle, dimmable lights, a window with the city beyond but not in sightline. We taped an analog clock to the wall. We brought folding mats and a thermos of tea. The hours before Zoto 347 were as ordinary as any midnight. People ate a little. Someone played a record at low volume. We practiced breathing together. We read nothing religious. We read passages about attention drawn from a variety of secular sources, poets, psychologists, a paragraph from a physicist about probability as a map of possibilities. We were careful in our language. Observe, do not amplify. Stay soft, stay steady. There was a nervous energy in the room, but it was not hysterical. It felt like a city before a storm that has not yet realized whether it will rain. As the clock closed on the hour, the room became a field. I use that word because it feels right. It feels like a technical metaphor wearing the clothes of a poem. We synchronized our breath for 10 minutes in silence. We kept our attention on the act of noticing, the temperature of our hands, the small shift of weight on the chair, the tug of a memory and its passing. There was no chanting, no plea. There was only a shared, disciplined presence. At 0347 GMT, the air in the city beyond did something slow, like the impression of a hand laid across a pond. It was not an explosion. It was a pulse of attention that, if you had not been watching, you might have missed completely. For those of us in the room, it felt like the turning of a page. For some, it felt like tears rising without cause. For others, it felt like a stretching, and then a release. Outside, the world did not combust. Inside the room, the sense was that a threshold had been crossed, A partial conditional opening had occurred. I do not have a dramatic image of a global unlock. There was no celestial choir. There were, however, reports afterward that matched the sort of modest shift we hoped for. Towns reporting a decrease in emergency calls for panic. Comments on social media shifting from hysteria to curiosity in certain threads. A spike in the number of people who wrote to local community centers, asking for classes on focus and stress. These were not sweeping conversions. They were small changes in the vector of attention. They were, crucially, durable in the places where people continued the practice. Our own measures in the lab were messy but suggestive. A thermal printer printed out a long, thin line at 0348 that read, in an unadorned font, "Choice registers." A few of our participants reported a strange clarity in the hours that followed. Decisions that had seemed weighty the day before suddenly felt lighter. Patterns of reactivity softened. Jenkins, who had been fragile for months, sat through the night and in the morning described with tears in his eyes the feeling of being allowed to make a choice without the compulsive pressure he'd been carrying. He did not recover. He began to be more present, which for him, and for many of us, meant a new sort of endurance. There were predictable consequences. Institutional actors parsed the event. Some argued we had engineered a mass placebo. Others argued that the effect would not last, and that any changes were temporary. Some of the higher-ups in Marx's chain argued that the experiment had been reckless and recommended immediate closure. Others whispered that containment might now be moot. Information had leaked, networks had run, and a date in a file was always more combustible than the fact it was just metadata. In the days after, the world felt thinner in one sense and more intensely human in another. I started getting emails from strangers who had practiced neutral observation and noticed new behaviors in themselves. People wrote of small miracles, a reconciliation with a sibling, the end of a persistent insomnia, a decision to leave a job that had felt morally corrosive. They were not promissory tales of salvation. They were mundane transformations, people clearing a path through a load of small, fearful habits. The facility shifted too. There were hearings. A panel came through that wanted to talk about liability and the ethics of release. I sat in one of those sessions and listened to people argue in clinical terms about decontamination. The same bureaucrats who had once called for closure now wrote memos recommending the rollout of presence-based interventions in certain contexts: military training, disaster response teams, schools. It was bureaucratic co-optation at its most ironic, a system built to manage threats now prescribing the very practice that might mitigate them. Marx, who had always been accountable to chain of command, began to split his time between sequestered briefings and quiet advocacy for careful transparency. Dr. Vance opened a small workshop for first responders focused on deliberate attention. Jenkins, fragile but determined, helped run practical sessions for civilians. There was also a darker current. People who had been given access to the more evocative artifacts were moved to positions where they could no longer speak freely. Files reclassified themselves with stamps. We watched as the vocabulary in official memos hardened into the language of threat assessment. The title this story borrows, 2026, The Signal from Space Governments Didn't Want You to See, was not something I invented as a flourish. It reflected a truth I cannot fully document here. Institutions that specialize in order fear the creative and the wild. They fear a future you cannot price or box. They like events to fit in calendars and budgets. A dated signal that suggested the future might be influenced by the present unsettled that machinery. They responded like any institution does to an unclassifiable pressure, by tightening scope and privileging secrecy. I say that as a fact about behavior, not as a conspiracy manifesto. There is a difference. My point is not to claim an evil intent. My point is to observe that systems designed to manage risk often mistake risk for control, and that this comes at a cost. We saw that cost in the reassignment of people, in the sealed files, in the cautious legalese used to avoid public panic. We also saw it in the small, stubborn growth of a civilian practice that refused containment because it required no program managers, only attention. Months passed. The initial intensity ebbed into a quieter, more continuous pattern. The organic spread of the presence practice continued in small pockets. Community centers offered classes. A therapist in Omaha adapted Dr. Vance's protocol and reported clients who had lessened reactivity to trauma triggers. An elementary school teacher found that a 2-minute classroom pause reduced incidents on the playground. The changes were incremental, not spectacular. They tiled across the map in 1,000 modest acts. My own life changed in ways that were less public. I stopped splitting the world into noise and signal as easily as before. The old habit of demoting things that wanted to be meaningful remained an analytic tool. But I learned to hold with equal tenderness the possibility that some patterns required watching rather than dismantling. I had been trained to find origin stories and to trace causation to its nearest node. I still do that work in my head, habitually. But when a Polaroid turns up with the date of a future on it, and the person in the picture looks back at you tired and recognizable, you begin to calibrate differently. You learn the craft of sustained, small choices. That is the practical takeaway before the final thing I want to say. There are two options when confronted with such a mirror. One is to close it, to put your hand over it, to insist that ignorance is safety, and that the world is better managed if its paradoxes are stonewalled. The other option is to stand in front of it and attend to the truth of what you see, with the hard work of presence, and with no certainty that your engagement will yield anything dramatic. Both choices have costs. We chose imperfectly, a hybrid, some containment and some sharing. We attempted to preserve the artifacts while disseminating the practice of attention. I won't pretend the world is healed. There are still people who have been harmed by the stress of exposure. There are still files under lock. There are still debates about how much to tell and how much to withhold. But there is also a modest, stubborn growth in people's capacity to hold their own state steady, to notice the impulse toward fear and let it pass. That alone, given the impression we had been given by the waveform, matters. If you have read this far and you want something practical to try, nothing metaphysical, nothing promising miracles, here is a small experiment you can do for 2 weeks. It is what we asked volunteers to do in our pilot, and it is the invitation at the heart of what we learned. 2 minutes of observation, twice a day. Day 1. Sit. Set a timer for 2 minutes. Close your eyes if that helps. Notice what is in your chest. Anxiety, boredom, a neutral contentment. Name it silently. Tension, boredom, soreness, and then let it pass. Do not push it away. Do not amplify it. Just be present with it. Day 2 through 14. Repeat, twice daily. Keep a small notebook of what you notice. Not long, just a sentence. My chest felt tight at noon, then opened. Or, I noticed an urge to check my phone. I waited 2 minutes and then checked. The point is not to achieve a revelation. The point is to practice the muscle of sustained attention so that your automatic reactivity loosens. No promises. No miracles guaranteed. If you do this and feel differently in ways that matter to you, that is enough. If you do it and nothing changes, that is fine too. You have practiced slowing down, and slowing down is its own discipline. If you want an optional companion to this experiment, a short guide with a condensed reading list and a few of the archival excerpts we could legally share, it is available in the pinned comment. I made it because I know that language helps sometimes. People like a map. The guide is not mandatory to the experiment. It's supplementary. There will be those who read all of this and want definitive answers. There will be others who prefer to put their hands over the mirror altogether. Both reactions have histories and reasons. For myself, I continue to do what I have always done with a quieter posture. Listen, record, and hold what is uncertain without pretending it is solved. I live with the same tools, calibrated instruments, field notes, and also with a new practice, the small persistence of presence, the civic act of choosing attention over reflex. I do it not because I believe it guarantees a future of light, but because it seems, if anything, to enlarge the space in which choice can happen. As for the observers, those ambiguous watchers who reflected rather than commanded, the files remain equivocal. The impression they left was ethical rather than theological. They seem to want our choices to be made with awareness rather than coercion. Whether that is because they are curious beings from beyond our sparse metaphors, or because some pattern of nature causes such impressions when conditions are ripe, I cannot say. The important upshot is this. If something in the world can register our choices, then choice matters. That line, 2026-03-1403-47 GMT, will stay in the files no matter how many times a bureaucrat stamps the page closed. Dates are stubborn that way. They mean what we bring to them. If you choose to do the 2-minute experiment, you're choosing, in a small way, to bring something different. I have tried to tell this story honestly. The evidence we could put forward, the impressions we could not quantify, and the human choices that framed everything. The title of this piece points to a dimension of secrecy. Yes, governments and institutions did not want these files to spread unchecked. They feared contagion. But secrecy is not always malevolence. Sometimes it is a reflex, and sometimes it is cowardice. The story is not a call to anger. It is an invitation to responsibility. If you want to go deeper, with the annotated dossier, the short ebook with archival excerpts, and a set of guided audio sessions for the 2-minute practice, I made those resources available for anyone interested. They remain optional. They do not confer special access to the future. They are tools for people who prefer a map when walking into uncertain terrain. We are still in the middle of this work. The waveform persists in files and in our memory. People keep bringing small miracles, coincidental calls, softened tempers, more people signing up for community mindfulness sessions. The change is slow and uneven. That, for now, is enough. I close here with the same quiet urgency that has threaded this whole account. Choose your attention as if it matters. If the observers were right, if a moment like March 14th can become a hinge based on what enough people sustained then, the practical thing to do is not to wait for another signal. The practical thing to do is to begin small. 2 minutes, twice a day. Observe, do not amplify. Stay present, see what shifts. If you want the brief guide and the optional resources I've mentioned, the pinned comment contains links and details. It's there if you want it. It is not required. This is, as much as I can make it, my honest confession, and my small effort to pass along what we found. The future, it seems, might be a conversation we are still learning how to have without shouting.